Okay, guys, welcome to episode number 13 of the Zobin Whiteboard show. Good news, bad news. Found out last week that the Zobin Whiteboard show was getting canceled. I lobbied with the network to just let me do a final episode, give me a 13th one. Not because that means anything as far as like unlucky or lucky. Technically, it'd be unlucky, but that's the tradition. But 13 is kind of an interesting number in television, which is what I consider this. It's YouTube, but it's TV. 13, traditionally in TV, was the number of episodes that a new show would get, to kind of test it out a little bit. You get your pilot episode, and if that gets approved and you get greenlit for a production of the series, okay, we're not going to necessarily commit to a full season. Let's see how this one works. Let's give it 13 episodes. Now, if you think about it, 13 is really a quarter of a year. So you have 13, 26, 39, 52 weeks. So 13 was kind of like, okay, we got 13 episodes. Let's see if this show builds up any kind of momentum. And if it did, and you'd know pretty early on if it was going to survive or not, then you would get that second 13 weeks and you would get the full season, which back in those days, for many years, was about 26 episodes. Although back in the 60s, you would have shows like Gunsmoke, Gilligan's Island that would have several episodes. Gilligan's Island's first season had 39 episodes. So that would have been really 3/4 of a year. Also, Saturday morning cartoons tended to be 13 episodes, was considered like a standard season run. So that would have been considered a full year for a Saturday morning cartoon. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch only had 13 episodes. So I kind of wanted to get to 13. When I did my TV show back in the Twin Cities back in the late 90s, I did 8 episodes. My ultimate goal was to get to 13. So that was kind of a special number for me. So even though the show's getting canceled, I was able to convince the network to give me kind of a final episode. And it was fitting because coming back to the planets really brings us back full circle to the very first episode of the series, which was the planetary baseball. Because I just like being open and honest about things, the ratings just were not there. Actually had pretty good ratings on the very first debut episode. That came out on January 8th. So I've been doing this for about 2 months now. And that was the planetary baseball. Ultimately, as of today, which is March 5th, I've had 80 views, which is still not good. I mean, that's not enough. 80, if that leads the league, that's not gonna cut it as far as continuing on with the series. As far as likes, it performed the best too. It had 9 likes. Of course, one of those was from me, but still, it's 9. After that came Animal Husbandry. That one is currently at 41 views, but a pretty good like ratio of 8. So I got an 8 thumbs up on that one. North Dakota Way, which is technically my favorite episode, did pretty good. It actually came in with 44 views, so that was the second most that I got, and had a 5 thumbs up score. So doing okay through these first few episodes. Number 4 was Phrenology. Remember, talked about like the brain and the skull, the shape of the skull, and how that affects personality. That one was on January 20th. Episode 2 was January 13th. North Dakota Way was January 15th. Phrenology, 32 views, which was down, but 6 thumbs up, which was the third most that I would get. Then came The Game of Life, which seemed to resonate the most with at least a few people. One of my sisters and an old friend of mine, Nick, seemed to like that one too. That was on January 23rd, but 26 views. So the numbers were definitely coming down, and only 3 thumbs ups. And then came the Punette or the Punette Square episode. That was also another one that was very fun for me. January 29th, again, 26 views, 4 votes up, which is not bad. Salad Days, which was definitely the strangest episode. I would say that was on February 3rd. got 28 views, 4 thumbs up. Then came Halcyon Days right after that on February 7th, 24 views, 3 thumbs up. So the momentum is definitely slipping in here. And I think even the network at that point had called me in for a couple of meetings and said, hey, come on, Zobes, you're going to have to perk things up a little bit here. And then on February 10th came You Are My Rock. That got 20. Remember the personality types and kind of comparing. If you say to somebody, hey, you're my rock, well, what kind of rock are you? Are you metamorphic? Are you isosceles? Are you cumulus? Get your head out of the clouds. That's another one I wanted to do, where if your head is in the clouds, when you say that, you really are inferring that it's in a cumulus cloud, because then it's all soft and fluffy and almost like a pillow that you're dreaming. But if your head was in the cirrus clouds or the stratus clouds, I think it would be a completely different activity that's going on, or a rain cloud. It would indicate depression. Anyway, that one got 1 vote, and that was from me, so basically got nothing. Radish bowling, I think we tried to jazz it up a little bit, bring in the electric, kind of electrifying radishes. Seemed like it was a good idea at the time. On February 14th, it's Valentine's Day, there's love. Got 22 views and only 2 thumbs up, and again, one of them is always coming for me. Okay, all right, I'm guilty. And then Shape of Things, we're really looking at Radish Bowling. Radish Bowling was just Radish Bowling. Shape of Things is the one where we electrified the radishes. And yes, I got a little bit obsessed with radishes in this show, in the radish eyes, and that probably doomed the whole thing. It's fine. 19 views, but I did get 3 thumbs up, which was nice. And then the last episode that I had done, number 12, was Potluck. That was February 25th. And that performed the worst. It only got 18 views and two thumbs up. So about a week ago, got called into the network, the Zobin Broadcasting System, ZBS, and they basically just broke it down and said, Zobes, look, we're pulling the plug on this thing, and it's just not working. And I lobbied again, though, to get that 13th episode, and that's what we're going to talk about, bring it full circle. But just wanted to give an explanation of what's happening. Now, the good news is, while this ends this chapter of this venture of mine, I fully intend to come back with more YouTube programming, but I'm just going to go in a different direction. I'm pretty excited about what's going to happen. I'll kind of just save it for when it comes out, but look for it in the next few weeks. There's going to be some just different programming that I'll be doing, but it'll be very different than what this is. Essentially, what I was trying to do with the Whiteboard show was to do almost like a performance art, YouTube show, but also, kind of throwing in lecture and just elements of interest. And I definitely enjoyed it, but I don't know if you're just not getting the viewership. I'm going to have these conversations with myself anyway. There's just no need to really videotape them. So anyway, the names of the planets. Oh, and it is a shame, though. I will say just one quick thing. I had just gotten my first dormant, defunct corporate sponsor, DeWitt's Antacid Powder. Rather than trying to get, contemporary corporate sponsorship like Nike or any kind of a product that's modern, I was going for products that don't exist anymore, like DeWitt's Antacid Powder. This company started about 100 years ago, and it's no longer in existence. But we were excited to partner with a defunct company, and certainly I needed it. I mean, I needed it after that disgusting pimento spread water chestnut taco of mine, and I really did have a pretty bad reaction to that. I wound up having a pretty upset stomach. I deserved it, frankly, but it was part of that potluck episode. Anyway, we would just like to say thanks for DeWitt's for, at least wanting to work with us, and maybe we can include them in the next venture on YouTube. Anyway, and then finally wanted to I'd make mention of this thing called Mayo Chup. And of course, Mayo Chup is a portmanteau, which was going to be a whole other spin-off series of this imaginary place called Portmanteau, which was all, just these mashups of different concepts. But Mayochup, just really quickly here, folks, is a portmanteau of mayonnaise and ketchup. So they opted to take the mayo and the chup portion of that to create Mayochup. They also, right there, you can kind of see that. But the other option they would have had would have been cat-nays. So they could have, and I hope that somebody in Heinz at least pitched the idea of, hey, how about we call it cat-nays? That's what I would have done. Another example of that would be when anybody, right now you will see, you'll hear all the time, in fact this is probably now in the dictionary, is ginormous. Okay, you guys I'm sure have heard somebody say the word ginormous, but ginormous is a portmanteau of gigantic and enormous. And so, and I had a guy that I used to work with at the Tribune, Dan Simmons, on the condition of anonymity here. So you can see, you've got the gi and the normous, right? So you're using a good chunk of enormous in that thing, and very little of this. Well, the opposite of that then would be egantic or gigantic, egantic or ginormous. So anyway, let's get, though, to the final program, and then our sponsors or our network wants to pull the plug on this, and we'll just get it over with. But, okay, so the names of the planets. This is something that I've been very fascinated with, and I've learned a lot of really cool things about just how, number one, who gets to pick the names of the planets, who does it now, who did it in antiquity, and just some of the grievances that I have about the names of the planets. Before I even start with that, these are the planets in our solar system, and of course I'm going to include Pluto. I mean, there's no question about that. But even the problem begins right off the bat, is that it's our solar system, and we call our sun, because we're so creative, the sun. We call our moon the moon. We call our God, God. Pretty generic terms. And even this extends to Earth itself. Just the name Earth is a old English Germanic word that just means the ground. And I'll talk about that when we get there. But just right off the bat, one thing that you notice is that you're going to see Roman names for many of the planets, 2 Greek names for 2 of the planets, and then in the case of the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, nothing. Not named after a god at all, which also seems a little ridiculous, since those are pretty significant, celestial bodies. What's important to remember is that the Greek gods came before the Roman gods, and when Rome invaded Greece, they liked the Greek gods, and essentially they co-opted them. And they changed the names, with the exception of very few. One of the ones they did not change the name of was Apollo, which is interesting that Apollo was not used for one of the names of the planets. Now we know that the missions, the space missions, are the ones that were named Apollo, but really that's a pretty substantial god to have been left out. We'll talk about that at the very end of this. So one of my first gripes right off the bat is our sun is just called the sun. And that seems kind of dumb, because the Greek god for the sun was Helios. And if we're going to accept the Roman names of the Greek gods, then all along our sun really would have just been called Sol. Hey Sol, how's it going? And you can see that in the word, though, solar, S-O-L. But technically speaking, instead of just us calling our sun the sun, I would suggest that if we're going to kind of standardize everything to the Roman names, which I'm okay with, then we'll call the sun Sol, okay? The moon also should not just be called the moon, although the B-52s on their debut album had a song called there's a moon in the sky, and then in parentheses, called the moon. So I think they were even making fun of this thing that we're just going to call our moon the moon. The Greek goddess, okay, and that's another grievance I have, is that most of these are all male, with the exception of Venus. You know, everything else is really named after a god, a male god. So I think there needs to be more female representation in here. Anyway, the Greek goddess of the moon would be Selene, and the Roman equivalent of that would be Luna. And I think that would be much preferable if we just called our moon Luna and thought of it as a female, you know, spirit that's up there. Then we get into the planets proper. And the reason why there's kind of a level of demarcation, and it happens after Saturn. Because after Saturn, the planets, at least in early times, were not visible. They were not visible and identified until the telescope. So the reason that these planets were named after the Roman gods, Mercury instead of Hermes, Venus instead of Aphrodite, we'll skip Earth for now, but Mars instead of Ares, and Jupiter instead of Zeus, and Saturn instead of Cronus, were because it was Babylonian astronomers, and they're the ones that identified these, and the Romans were actually the ones that named them because they could see them, and they were naming them after their gods, which again were predicated on the Greek gods. Other than Mercury, which did make sense because Mercury is kind of the messenger god, and he was very fast. Mercury orbits the sun the fastest. I think it's 88 days or something like that. So there is a correlation between what Mercury was, or Hermes was as a god, and kind of the characteristics of the planet. The other example of that would be Jupiter, the great big Jupiter, and you would think of Zeus as being the great, you know, king of the gods on Olympus, and then Jupiter obviously would be the Roman equivalent. Venus, it's interesting because, and Venus is the only female planet that's named after a goddess, but because people couldn't see Venus, you know, is really a pretty uninhabitable, uninviting place in reality. It's the hottest planet. Oh my God, is it hot? Venus is hot. Anyway, but up until even into the 20th century, the people's perceptions of Venus is the romantic idea of it is that it was very verdant, very lush, that there would have been life on Venus, and it would have probably been very sexy alien life. Anyway, but that was the idea, that there was the idea that Venus was probably a very beautiful planet. Then we get, let's skip Earth for now. I'm going to come back to it after we get to Saturn. Mars and Ares are linked, and Mars was the god of war. There wasn't really a lot of correlation with that, because I don't think there's anything really violent going on in Mars. If anything, Mercury could have been Mars, but that's a whole other story. Jupiter makes sense. Saturn really doesn't, and we love that name. Saturn is one of the best planet names for sure, and it's the most stunning for sure. At least many people would think so. But really the Greek equivalent was Cronus. And even though Cronus is a significant Greek god in the sense that he's like kind of the first god, but he plays a very unimportant role throughout Greek mythology after kind of his debut, where he helps create all these gods, and then he eats his children, and then they come out of his head, and then they kill him, and it's just the whole thing gets kind of messy. It doesn't really seem to fit Saturn, because if you think about it, Cronus would almost be like what would be the first planet, and it wasn't Saturn. Let's circle back to Earth, because Earth, you know, what's interesting is, as human beings, we call ourselves the water planet, right? And we think that if life is going to exist on other planets, it's only going to be because there's water on those planets, which already shows how deficient our thinking is, because who's to say you couldn't have ammonia-based life that would be intelligent but would be very different than what we would comprehend. But we're convinced that you have to have water. That's why we think there's potential on Mars, and even some of the satellites of Jupiter, and even I think out to Neptune, some of the moons that they actually give names to. And who actually gives them names now would be the International Astronomical Union, the IAU. There was actually a guy named Lars Christensen in Tucson, Arizona that I was thinking about calling at some point to tell him about my gripes, but it's pointless because the show's getting canceled anyway, so we don't care. Anyway, this is where it gets interesting, though, because Uranus was identified in 1781, and it was identified by Sir William Herschel. And because he's the one that discovered the planet, he got to name it, or at least got to suggest some names. And at one point, this planet was going to be called Herschel, Herschel. If you're a sports fan, think Herschel Walker. That didn't gain any traction, he thought, and I'm guessing he was just being a total brown-noser here. He suggested calling it Georgium Sidus. Georgium would have been to honor King George, who would have been in power at that time. And again, that just didn't fly. What happened is, I think when they realized that you had all these Roman names, or names after gods, then I think people eventually realized, okay, let's continue with that. The curious thing is, though, why they would choose to call it Uranus, which would be the Greek god, when they'd been doing Roman, and the Greek god Uranus would have been the god of the sky. Okay, so it's fitting. Uranus was not one of the Olympian gods, but the Roman equivalent would have been Caelus. And of course, had they just called it Caelus all along, which is not a bad name actually at all, you avoid the whole thing. No matter how you pronounce that, you're in trouble, because it's either your anus or Uranus. And so either way, you get these really bad puns that have been wonderful for many of us. But at the end of the day, though, had they kept that form that was going, that format of the Roman names, it would have been Caelus. Neptune was identified in 1846, and that was by John Couch Adams. And there was a few different names suggested for Neptune, but ultimately they made the decision just to go with the god of the water, which is Poseidon, which is because of the blue color of it. Even though there's really no water on Neptune, it was just the blue that harkened to the water and Poseidon. Interestingly enough, I feel like Earth should actually be called Neptune, because again, we consider ourselves here the water planet. 71% of our planet is water. It's not Earth. It seems puzzling that we would call our planet Earth after the characteristic that is not unique to supporting life. It's water that we think is. So in reality, Earth should almost be called Neptune, and then you could give a different name, to Neptune. Similarly, I guess I'll circle back to Earth here. If you were to actually have given us a Greek and a Roman name, then the goddess, Mother Earth, the goddess, though, of Earth would be Gaia. That would have been the Greek name. And then if you had flipped that to Roman, then it would have been either Terra or Tellus, Tellus. But you could get by with Terra as well. And then finally, that brings us to little Pluto, which was discovered in 1930 by Clyde Tombaugh. And they had a contest, actually a naming contest, and a little girl named, 11-year-old girl named Venetia Burney had suggested Pluto. And that just does seem perfect, even though Pluto is actually the Greek god, the Roman equivalent, and this would be the god of the underworld and of afterlife, which again seems not necessarily the most logical, but it's a cute name, and we all love it. And it's named by an 11-year-old girl, so we're not gonna change it. But the Roman equivalent would have been Dispater, and that would have been, again, the god of the underworld. What's interesting, though, is the gods, the 12 Olympian gods, who are the most significant, that were not actually used to name the planets. And there's some big heavy hitters, including lots of female options that would have been available. So Artemis, for example. And Artemis would have been the goddess of the hunt, and the Roman equivalent of Artemis would have been Diana. So I could see maybe one of these planets having the name Diana, Apollo. Apollo is it's almost inexcusable that Apollo was not used for one of the planets. Apollo was actually a god of the sun, okay? You could even justify potentially calling the sun Apollo, but certainly I think especially one of these interior ones of Venus, Mercury could have easily been Apollo, potentially even out to Mars could have been called Apollo. And Apollo was the Greek name and the Roman one, so that was maybe even one of their favorite ones because they did not change the name of it. The Romans would say Phoebus Apollo. Okay, anyway, Athena, which would have been the goddess of wisdom, and Minerva would be the Roman equivalent. And can't you just imagine this being Minerva, or maybe this being Minerva, or potentially even the moon? I guess you could even argue a case for that. Athena, let's see, we just talked about her, and then Hestia. Hestia would have been the goddess of home, and the Roman equivalent would have been Vesta. And you could argue a case that you could call Earth Hestia or Vesta because it would be home, right? And Hephaestus was one of the 12 Olympian gods, the equivalent, the Roman equivalent, Vulcan, And you could easily argue a case that Vulcan, the god of fire, would have had either Mercury, potentially Venus, but we want to keep, at least Venus for, having female representation, and certainly Mars, or potentially the sun, being Vulcan. Demeter would be the goddess of agriculture, and the Roman equivalent would have been Ceres, Ceres. And again, you could argue a case of Earth being called Ceres, or Demeter, but if you were going with the Roman name, Ceres. And then Hera, who would be the goddess of marriage, and then the Roman equivalent would be Juno. And I would say, honest to God, or honest to goddess, you could argue Artemis having Apollo. I would say Athena, potentially even Hestia. I would say Vulcan for sure, and maybe even Ceres. So there were some good ones that were left off of the chart. The ones that were not Olympian gods would have been Uranus or Caelus, Poseidon, or actually, hang on, nope, that one was, and Saturn was not, Cronus was not an Olympian god, and also Pluto, Despoter, and then certainly, the sun, Earth was not, the sun was not, and the moon was not. So anyway, guys, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. For those of you who did hang with me, I really do appreciate it. Like I said, this is going to be it for this, vision, this particular project. We got 13 episodes out of it. I had a lot of fun making them, but like I said, look for new programming soon. I've got several ideas that I'm kicking around, and I'm just going to try to figure out which one makes the most sense, and maybe even which ones. I might do multiple things. I'm not sure. But anyway, that was it. So I can't say see you next time on the Whiteboard Show because this is the last one. But hopefully for those of you, again, who hung with me, I really do appreciate it. And we will see you at some point with something. And just whatever you do not ever make a taco with... This stuff was horrible, pimento spread. I remember it as a kid. And I remember kind of liking it, but it was disgusting. And these water chestnuts, I suppose in chow mein or chop suey or whatever, they're kind of more of an accent thing, and they're fine. And it's supposed to be a heat them up too, but when you just throw them into a taco, they were really very disturbing, and the two of them combined were disgusting. So we needed duets, but anyway, you guys hang tight, and hopefully we will see you soon. Take care.